Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Bob Mendelsohn, and this is the Bob's Your Uncle podcast. Today we speak with Laura Mitchell, a young environmental scientist here in Sydney. We're going to talk about contamination and spatial data. It really is great stuff. Stay tuned. Thanks for joining me for this Season 3, Episode 28 of the Bob's Your Uncle podcast. The music is Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto in E minor, and the opinions are strictly my own and those of my guests. You can now find us and comment to us wherever you get your podcasts. Tell us what matters to you, what triggers your joy, what bothers you in the world. Let us know. We'll see where the Spirit leads us. Whether you're at home, online, on the road with me in your headset at the gym, or out for your evening constitutional, wherever you get your podcast, that's where we will be. Thanks for being with us these 18 minutes. On this date in history, July 4th, 1776, the United States declared independence from Britain. In 1838, Huskar Colliery mining disaster in Silkstone, England. The mining pit flooded and drowned 26 children, which led to the 1842 Mines and Collieries Act that banned women and children from working underground. In 1939, Lou Gehrig is the first Major League player to have his number retired on his Appreciation Day, July 4th, 1939, at Yankee Stadium, when he made his iconic Luckiest Man speech. And 3 American presidents died on the 4th of July, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, in the same year, 1826, and James Monroe in 1831. And that's the historical marker for the week. Laura Mitchell, you live here in Sydney. We've known and seen each other across a building here and there, and we ran into each other on a bus recently. Mm-hmm. I was fascinated when we spoke, and you told me that you were involved in your current job with contamination. Mm-hmm. And immediately my mind said, wow, I must have this woman on my podcast. So thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Before you were born, just as I moved here with my wife and kids, 25 years ago, Sydney Water had a major crisis with 2 little parasites, Cryptosporidium and Giardia, little microscopic troubles that caused diseases, and they were parasites. It's the most, I think it's the leading cause of waterborne diseases of humans in the United States. So it was pretty exciting for me on arrival in Sydney to encounter this. You deal with contamination. Mm-hmm. How wide does that go? What fields do you cover?
Right. So like what you're talking about there, it's sort of the like biological side of contamination. And a lot of it's very active. So those sources of Giardia and stuff, they would have been coming from farms as they were being produced. And a lot of the contamination I deal with is based on historical or like active businesses that produce chemicals. So a lot of it is on the chemical side of contamination. That biological side is a whole other field of contamination that I'm not involved a lot in. But it all kind of interlinks with each other.
There's electromagnetic contamination. Mm-hmm. There's a wide
radioactive contamination. There's some
right. Radioactivity is something that we were concerned about in the 80s with
Mm-hmm.
Russia, and then, of course, a 3 Mile Island in Pittsburgh,
Mm-hmm.
outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of worry about things. If you had to define contamination, what what would be some of the elements to that?
I guess it's kind of like a weed in the sense of a lot of these chemicals are very useful and they have real applications to things. But if they're in the wrong place, the wrong time where you don't want them to be, then that's when it becomes a problem. That's when it becomes a contaminant, I suppose.
The word kosher means
Mm-hmm.
fit for use. So these things, which are good in one place or another, can soil or corrupt or infect other things and make them unfit for use. And so you've got a job of determining what's good, what's bad in a soil or in a concrete slab. What's the main field in which you work?
So I look at a lot of sometimes we don't know what's in the soil because there's not very good record keeping of what businesses were in a particular site at a particular time. It was pretty poorly done, and a lot of the environmental protections we have that are on a federal basis, they didn't come around till the 1990s. So the Contamination Act didn't come till 1997 in Australia, where we really kept good record of all contaminated activities. So everything pre-1997, there's a lot that we've got to correct for in that.
Where do you and your company seek contaminants? Is it regional? Is it national? Is it very localized?
Well, it depends on usually if you're building upon a brownfield site, so a site that's had previous industrial industry on it, and you want to then convert that to a residential or an open space or a school, especially schools and places where there will be vulnerable people, that's when the government will enforce companies and stakeholders to launch an investigation, see if there is contaminants because you're moving to a more sensitive form of land use. So what like my job is to basically do a lot of history, digging through like archives, through historical maps, looking through historical aerial imagery and stuff like that. And even like the old phone books and the old yellow pages, and digging through those old archives, trying to do some detective work to figure out what businesses were there at one point and, you know, like how long were they there for and all those kind of things.
That sounds so exciting. How did you get into this career trajectory?
I studied environmental science, and a lot of the work that environmental scientists go into is doing this form of consulting where they figure out what the land is before you start building upon it.
What are you really looking? You're looking for toxicity, you're looking for trouble, you're looking for maybe petroleum leakage
Mm-hmm.
at a school or asbestos residue. What are you looking for, animals, or are you just looking for chemical stuff?
So we're looking for like what if you go on a site and you start digging, there's about 1 billion things you can test for. And, you know, you can't just test for everything blindly because it's a very expensive process. You have to send soil samples off to the lab. So a lot of what I do is figuring out what could be there. So we can limit the range of what needs to be tested. So a lot of the things like service stations are a big problem. As you can tell, the underground storage tanks, they aren't always built super strong and they do leak often. So, you know, even if we look through some state databases have the diagrams for where the placement of these underground tanks were back in the 60s. And so if I can find that kind of information, it can be really helpful for a property developer to understand where things could be.
This detective work in which you are participating, my goodness, it sounds like you're right up there ready for Scotland Yard. Is that something you'd like to get into? 10 years from now?
Detective work. Well, apparently I've got the precursors for that. Yeah, that's interesting. It's a bit scary though, because you don't want to miss any crucial details. That's it, because that can become a liability if you miss something really big that you got to watch out for. But the things that you do need to take in consideration is it's not just the contaminant, because even if there is a contaminant present, if the industry it's moving to is not a super vulnerable one, where you could there's some limits of contamination you're allowed, and it's deep within the soil that you won't be disturbing. And also things like, is the groundwater flow through there, or are there any streams that could help mobilize contaminants? So you're not just collecting information about what contaminants are there, what concentrations could they be at, but also, are they going to move, and how do they move through the environment?
You also said that you're involved in spatial data science.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what does that mean? This
Spatial
is
that is it's I find it a really cool way of analyzing data, because you don't just have to look at graphs and numbers, you get to look at maps and points and shapes on maps and how they relate to each other. So what we have is, like, for example, we have a built database of like EPA defined contaminated land, and we can overlay that with the shape of our site boundary. And that way we can cut out all the information that relates to our boundary, on to what kind of information we have on that site. And so that's what spatial science does. It basically figures out what spatially is related to each other. You could think that your site's all clean, but if there was, a dry cleaner next to it for decades, then obviously your site's going to be impacted as well. And also, a lot of the information we have, like the addresses from the 1930s, are very different now to the addresses of 2023. So we have to take into account, like the address won't be perfectly match up with modern day standards. So we do like apply like a buffer around our site. So we won't just look at our site, but we'll look maybe like a kilometer away, up to a kilometer away from where our site is, to see if there's any particular points of interest around.
How'd you choose environmental science?
That's a good question. Well, I immediately ruled out quite a few things because I don't like words too much, and I couldn't stand the thought of writing essays, so that cuts out any kind of social science, or definitely not law. I would be cut out for that. Ever since I was a kid, used to love going out to the bush and picking up sticks and discovering what things I can find in the bush. And I was always coming up with presentations on my own about all the animals I found interesting and all of that. And I don't know, I was always drawn to discovering more about Earth and a beautiful creation, and I just think that's really cool. And also it's something that needs to be protected.
It does need to be protected. There's something about that religious orientation that some I know, certainly I do have, that says God made the world and he gave it to humanity to maintain, not to ruin. So is your job part of that maintenance?
Oh, for sure. I mean, a lot of it is protecting people, and protecting the environment, because you can't live in an unsafe environment and expect to be safe yourself. And it's not something you'd want to live in, knowing that there's radioactive waste next door.
10 years from now, what might you be doing?
That's a great question, because I have no clue. And I kind of don't want to have a clue, because if I set myself on something, then I might ignore opportunities that come my way instead. So I like to I mean, the job I got now, I wasn't really looking for it. I just came up one night and I applied, and it was very different from the other applications that I did to find a job. And I got this one, and I really love the work I do. And I'm really thankful that the opportunity presented itself to me.
But you want to leave your options open.
Yeah, I mean, I might still be working in contamination in 10 years, or I might be doing something completely different.
Laura, anything else you want to tell the ever-increasing Bob's Your Uncle worldwide audience?
Thanks for listening, everyone. Make sure that you follow Bob on all of his channels. I would say keep your consumption low. The environment is good, and we want to keep it like that. Yeah.
Should people walk or bicycle to work instead of drive, or ride the bus?
If you can, do it. Ride the bus. You might meet some lovely people on it. You never know.
You and I were on a bus together. How random was that? No, that's great. Laura, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
God bless you in your endeavors, certainly in environmental science and all these decontamination. You're not really involved in contamination. No. You're involved in decontamination.
Exactly.
And that's my job. I think I do that too. I'm a minister, and I'm involved in decontaminating the world. That's my job. Start with myself. I better get clean. Exactly. Hey, thanks so much, and have a great rest of the year. What do you think about all this? Write me on bobmendo@aol.com, or comment or even video to me on Instagram or Twitter at Bob's Your Uncle PC. I'd love to know what you think about all this. Don't forget to post a review on iTunes or Spotify, wherever you're getting your podcasts. And also, don't forget to subscribe. Every week we read from the #1 bestseller of all time, the Bible. And this week is no different. From James chapter 1, pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Please join me again next week as we will launch a new episode on Tuesday, wherever you are. And I hope you have a blessed week. Stay unstained from the world, won't you?